Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.
The interview series Reflections in Time was begun by the late Professor Paul Borghi more than 20 years ago. This new series continues Paul's work and is dedicated to his memory. My name's Jack Newton. I'm retired now, but I'm still active as a professor emeritus. I've been on the faculty of UN Omaha since 1960, and I served for 20 years as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. I worked closely with Professor Borghi in the development of the original interview series, and I can think of no more fitting tribute to him than to continue this work. We're here this morning in the studios of KYNE Television. It's a beautiful spring day in Omaha in the year 2001, and I have as my guest Professor William Blizek from the Department of Philosophy and Religion. Bill, welcome. It's good to have you here with us.
Thanks. I'm glad you're continuing the series.
Yeah. I should mention that you are in the Department of Philosophy and Religion, as I did, but you're a professor of philosophy.
That's correct. My training is in philosophy.
Right. And you joined the faculty more than 30 years ago.
30 years ago. This is the end of my 31st year. That's right.
You know, we've known each other for a long time, Bill. One thing I don't think I've ever talked to you about, though, is your roots. You know, where did you grow up? Where'd you come from? Can you tell us a little about yourself?
I'm a sort of odd duck. I was actually adopted by my parents, Ed and Pearl Blizek, and after my first year of the orphanage and so forth. They were in the American dream, and the idea was to move to the suburbs. And so I grew up in a suburb of Chicago called Elmhurst, Illinois. And when I grew up there, it was the housing development we were in was all surrounded by farmland, and when I was a kid I'd go down to the end of the block and help the farmer bale hay and so forth. And now, of course, that's all apartment complexes and stores and buildings and medical centers, and it's a very different place than it was when I grew up.
We've seen things like that happen right here in Omaha, where cornfields quickly grew into shopping centers.
That's right. That's right, and it's still happening here in Omaha.
So you went to school there?
I went to York Community High School. Was a very good school, but it had 4,000 students instead of the 2,000 it was built for my first 2 years, and finally they built a second school and things eased up and so forth. But when I went in the first 2 years, they had upstairs and downstairs, just as the movie Blackboard Jungle, and people carried weapons with them all the time and had fights, and so much of what we're fussing about today was pretty common back in my time, at least.
And then you, when you graduated from high school, you went on to college.
I went to Southern Illinois University because there was a young woman I'd met named Cindy, whose last name I've now forgotten, and she was from El Dorado, Illinois, and had this absolutely wonderful Southern accent, and so I decided I'd go down there, and some of my friends were going down and so forth. And
Southern Illinois is down there in Carbondale, right?
That's right, that's right. And it was actually a very, very marvelous experience. They did some remarkably interesting things at Southern Illinois. They would hire people who had retired. They'd take somebody like you, and they'd hire them to teach a course now, and they paid them pretty good money, so it was attractive. They'd have their retirement. And so I got to work with some pretty famous people down there in small classes, and that was very, very exciting. Buckminster Fuller was down there. He came down after he retired.
He was here, been on this campus as a speaker a number of times back in the early 60s.
Right, right. So, and that would have been...
In fact, you know, I was I almost went there myself. As a professor, at the same time I applied here, I applied there and was offered a position there. But unfortunately, I'd taken the position here first. And, well, first of all, because I had friends here, I decided that I'd rather stay here. But also there was kind of an ethical consideration. I'd already accepted this position, and they were expecting
Well, we would have
me.
been there together then.
But, yeah, I could have been a professor at Southern Illinois. And you graduated from there with a bachelor's degree?
I got a bachelor's degree in philosophy there. I think this is true for most students. You go into a field where somebody is finds you a good student, and they nurture you. And it was Elizabeth Ames at Southern Illinois. She was a teacher of philosophy, and I just happened to get into a course on logic, but was doing well, and she was encouraging, and her husband taught there as well, so then I took a class from him, and again, they were so student-oriented that it was made it very attractive to be in philosophy.
So that's how your interest in philosophy developed through a contact with a professor.
That's right, and I had probably thought about going into religion or English, but nobody in those departments you know, was especially nice to me. Where they weren't unkind or anything, but there wasn't a connection with anybody there, and there was in philosophy, and I think that's what sort of drew me to the field. And then after I got into the field, of course, the field itself was so fascinating that
Did you start out in another major? Or,
Oh, I started out as an engineer, and went through a variety of majors, or at least thinking about them. Did spend a while. I wanted to be a football coach for a while, and I had an opportunity and did actually coach football at my old high school, because Southern Illinois didn't start until late September, so I could get about 6-7 weeks of coaching in, and my old coaches invited me to join them, and that was a lot of fun. So for a while I was thinking of going into coaching, but I didn't want to do that exclusively. So I thought if I had a degree in something else, maybe I could combine those sorts of things.
Well, did you play football at
Yeah, in high school I played football.
Not at Southern Illinois?
Not at Southern. That was a different world there. It was quite a step up. A lot of the people who played came out of the service, and I was still weighing about 150 pounds at the time, and so that wasn't going to be for me. I did wrestle 1 year there, because I had wrestled in high school, but even at that rate, it was still, that was big-time sports. And
well, how long did you stay in engineering or other fields before you changed to philosophy?
I kept, I think, 1 year in engineering, and then the next year was in athletics and coaching and so forth, and then finally I was, by the time you get to be a junior, you ought to be settling down a little. And
you hope so.
So I was trying to settle down, and I actually did go to the Department of Religion, and I was looking for guidance and help and so forth, but nobody, either they weren't available, or the people I talked to didn't seem very interesting or interested in me, and so then I talked to somebody in philosophy, and they were, again, very student-oriented. They did a nice job. I had a great advisor throughout the rest of my career and so forth.
Well, that's a little unusual. Not unusual to have a professor take an interest in you and become interested in the field because of that, but the field of philosophy doesn't attract a large number of students, does it?
Well, it actually does in some ways. There's lots of students take philosophy classes. They find it interesting.
I meant as a major.
Yes, that's right, because then they find out that the employment situation. When I was in school, of course, being employed in philosophy was a likely prospect. I got my PhD in 1970. That was the very first year that not everyone who graduated got a job. The year before, everyone got a job, and throughout the 60s, you know, the prospects seemed quite good, and higher education was growing and so forth. So I didn't worry about that. Nowadays, of course, it's 200 applicants for every job that's available, and lots of PhDs in philosophy working in the business sector and so forth. But in those days, it was pretty open, and people could major. We still have people who major and then go on to work in business, but they like the ability to write and the ability to think and and be able to articulate their ideas well. And they are, you know, philosophy deals with the fundamental questions, and people are always, young people are generally interested in that, and so they take an interest in it. And
well, it looks, I've heard some rumors that the cycle is kind of swinging back now, and the jobs are, you may have 200 applicants now, but in the next few years, with all the people retiring from the baby boom generations and so on, that we're going to get back to the way it was back in 1970.
Right. We really heard that in the late 80s. The 90s were going to be the years of the retirement. But in fact, in philosophy, what's happened is that when somebody retires in philosophy, they don't fill the line. And so the number of philosophy teachers and programs has begun to shrink, and there's still lots of job applicants for every job that's available. So.
Well, then you evidently had more than a passing interest in it, because you went on and got a couple of advanced degrees.
Yes, it was.
Started in with
I stayed at Southern Illinois for my master's degree because I'd been given an assistantship in the Department of Community Development. I had a friend in the department. He talked to the faculty. They had a research assistant job open, and so I had an opportunity to continue going to school and also have some financial support, and so I took that opportunity, and then I started applying to various schools for my PhD work, and the University of Missouri offered me a teaching assistantship, so that's where I went.
Well, deciding to go on to graduate school, and I presume with the idea of going into higher education as a career, that's a kind of a major decision. Do you remember how you made that? How you decided that I am going to earn an advanced degree? And
I don't think I ever thought about it very much. That is, if you were taking courses in philosophy and getting a master's degree and so forth, there was kind of an expectation. That's what everybody else was doing. It isn't as though we were talking about what career we should follow. It sort of seemed natural, and so it just continued. And as I say, since the jobs were really plentiful in those days, there wasn't any question about whether you could get a job in philosophy. And so we all continued to pursue that. I would point out that Michael Espy, who's my colleague here now, came to Southern Illinois from Whitman College. That's right, Whitman College. And we spent our master's year together in Carbondale, and then he stayed for his PhD there, and I moved on to the University of Missouri.
So this is a colleague now at UN Omaha who
time together
you were a graduate
school.
student with. That's interesting,
yeah.
Isn't it? Yeah. Something similar happened to me. I was a graduate student at Ohio State, and a close friend of mine in graduate school, well, actually we went on, this was Korean War days, and we went into the Army together and spent time after graduate school together. And then I went my way in one direction, and he came here. And a couple years later, I got a phone call from him saying, "Hey, I've got a job opening here. Would you like to apply for it?" So I ended up with being a colleague of a person that I'd known in graduate school, too.
Who was that?
Bill Janes.
I don't think I remember him, but
yeah, he left here in 1967. So
when I first came here, there were a couple of people left, and they were adding a position, and so there were some jobs available, and so I called Mike and said, you know, I think we got something here that you might be interested in. Why don't you apply? He did, and
those networks do work that way.
Well, at least they get you in the door, and they get you the information, and you can figure out how to do things. I'm sure if he were not the best candidate, we wouldn't have hired him. We've done pretty well with that, and I think everybody tries to do that.
So you did you apply other places besides Missouri, or
I think I applied to about 10 different schools. Got accepted at some, but without financial assistance, and that wasn't going to work for me. And so Missouri was the place where I knew I could have the financial assistance. I was a teaching assistant, and the first day I walked into my class, I had sole responsibility for the class. So I did at whatever my age was then, 24 or 23, exactly the same things I do now.
But you already had a master's degree
but I had
at
a
that
master's
point.
degree,
It wasn't a matter of
and it was introductory level courses only. So, but they called you an assistant instructor, I think, which means that you didn't assist, but you got the pay of the assistant, and you had to do all the work, is what it meant. So that was my start at the University of Missouri. But it was an invaluable experience to start teaching your subject at the same time that you were studying it, and being able to do that was wonderful. So I always appreciated the opportunity.
Missouri must have had a fairly good reputation as a place to go to graduate school in philosophy.
The Ames had come from Missouri. They had moved to Southern Illinois, so again there was a connection there, and they of course had recommended me and so forth. And the Ames were very interesting people. Morris Ames integrated the first Boy Scout troop in Columbia, Missouri, and in those days, you know, in the 60s, we were all interested in social change and sort of developing a new nation and making these kinds of changes. The civil rights movement had gone on, so I really admired the Ames and the efforts they made in that regard. So it made Missouri very attractive, since they'd come from there. And I didn't want to do all of my work at the same institution, and I think that's a good thing.
So you spent, what, 3 years?
I did actually get out in 3 years. Managed to do it pretty quickly. Just kept my nose to the grindstone and planned things well at the outset.
Well, sometimes in your field particularly, doctoral dissertation can be a bit challenging.
That's right. 5 or 6 years is the sort of average. But I selected an advisor I knew would get me through and would work diligently with me, would keep me on task and so forth. And I watched other kids get advisors who didn't pay much attention to them, and they ended up, you know, spending a lot of time waiting for their advisor and so forth. So part of it was just practical, common sense arrangement of things.
Well, it's not quite like in the sciences, where you may set up an experiment and collect some data and then you know, write up the results, and that's your dissertation. You have to
right. And I was, when I came here, I came in the field of aesthetics and social and political philosophy, and I had arranged to take courses so that I would be marketable in those particular areas.
Is that the area you worked on it for your dissertation?
Yes, right. I did a dissertation in aesthetics, and that was the area of interest for my advisor. And then I taught ethics, and I took courses in social and political philosophy, or more of them than would be normal, so that I would have the sort of range of things that I could be teaching and so forth. So.
So then you came to UNO.
I came to UNO. I had 2 job offers, and in the interview with the president of the institution, it was, not here, but at this other institution, it was very clear that he didn't like people who were interested in doing research. And I don't, pointy-headed liberal academic wasn't the term he used, but it was similar to that. It was clearly going to be a hostile environment to somebody who wanted to do research. And when I came here, of course, the whole process was that we had now moved from the municipal university, and we were part of the University of Nebraska system, and we would be sort of operating as I think universities ought to operate, giving their faculty time to carry out various research projects. So
that's right. That was back in 1970.
1970, right.
And so we had just changed from a municipal institution a year and a half or so earlier.
That's right. And all of that was sort of on the minds of people. They were interested in how this was going to affect them, and I would say in those days, and I think you might see this too, that there were people who had been a part of the municipal university that weren't as comfortable in the new situation. The expectations were changing. And so it was kind of an interesting time here.
Well, who was the president back then? Was it Dr. Naylor?
Kirk Naylor was the president. That's what he was called in those days. And I think he was president for the very first year that I was here, because I remember returning from vacation where Joe Lavoie and I had gone on vacation together, and when we got back...
Dr. Lavoie in the psychology
department. We shared offices in the same area, in the library office annex in those days.
Ah, okay. Let's just digress for a minute, because some people may not remember that. The area now where the registrar's office is, I think.
That's right. That's right.
It was part of the old library, which is now the administration building.
Right.
And that area was kind of tacked on to the library.
There is a flat
nowadays you wouldn't notice it
because
it was built, it was designed quite well.
Right.
But we had a surge in the faculty. I mean, a big increase in the number of faculty. So we built this annex onto the library, and as you say, doubled people up.
That's right.
Put them together in offices in order to just find office space for them.
Right.
And you and Joe Lavoie shared an office.
No, Joe actually shared an office with Dale Stover.
Oh, okay.
But it was right across the hall from me, and so we'd gotten to know each other in the first year we vacationed in Colorado together with our families and so forth. And in those days, of course, where I parked was a gravel parking lot where the College of Business.
Yes, I remember Lot D.
Yes, yes, that's right.
And then if you had a big rainstorm, it wasn't gravel anymore, it was mud.
That's right, that's right. And no cover. If it hailed, your car took a beating.
Right.
And,
you didn't get to a paved lot until you became an assistant or an associate professor.
I think that's about right.
That's right.
Yeah. And it was actually kind of nice because Carl Jackson was there, and Joe Lavoie, and
these were all psychology.
They were all psychology people, but they were good at doing certain kinds of research, and so early in my career I wanted to try some different teaching methods, and they were there and stepped in and helped us design ways of evaluating the success of our teaching and so forth, and that turned out to be a real good thing. Sometimes when you're just with your own department, it's not as exciting intellectually as when you get to interact with people from various departments.
Well, what was, we've talked a little bit about what the university was like back then. Let's get back on track and talk about what it was like academically. What was the philosophy and religion department like back then?
Well, we were what I would say was a growing department. We'd added some people and some new people. We had one person leave the first year that I was there, and somebody the third or fourth year, and they were adding a line and so forth. So it was pretty exciting intellectually, new people to talk to and so forth. Politically, it was a little difficult because there was some animosity between people in religion and people in philosophy, and it was a little...
both fairly small faculties at the time.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Maybe how many people in each one?
Well, I think that's about 4 or 5 in philosophy, and there was always one more person in philosophy than religion, because the order of hiring had always been that you hired in philosophy and then in religion. So, and I think the people in religious studies worried about that they could always be outvoted, and there's a little discomfort and so forth. And in some ways, I think that still affects the department because we have some people still with us from those days. And
it could be worse. Back in the 50s, it was philosophy, religion, and psychology.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And there
then
are other...
you really got outvoted because there were more psychologists.
Right. And there are other departments, like the Department of Philosophy and the College of Education, and philosophy and political science. Those kinds of arrangements, academic, administrative arrangements, are different all over.
Right. The idea, of course, is with the small numbers of faculty that the overhead costs, you know, the secretarial help and all that stuff is it makes sense to find 2 small groups with some kind of similar interests.
That's right.
Anyhow,
That's
put
right.
them together.
Oh, I think administratively it's a great benefit. It's a great benefit to the faculty too, to to be a member of a larger department,
Yeah.
even though not everyone has
Right.
the same discipline.
Yeah, we've done that here with a number of departments. Oh, there's sociology and anthropology,
Yes,
where
right.
anthropology has a much smaller number. There's
Right.
geography and geology, which now have grown to almost equal numbers,
That's
but at
right.
one time there was only one geologist.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And you'd hate to be somebody in one of those small departments that had to go to a different department
Yes.
and beg for help. And I mean, it's much better to put them together,
Yeah.
I think. So.
It makes some sense administratively and, as you say, intellectually as well. And there's some kind of cross-fertilization, I'm sure, that takes
Well,
place.
I think so, and I think at this point in time, which is now 30 years later, we're really making some strides to do that. Of course, we've created the Journal of Religion and Film, which Ron Burke and I edit, and so here's somebody in philosophy, but also somebody in religion working together, and we have a new person in Judaic studies who's interested in medieval philosophy, so we're going to ask him to teach some medieval courses in medieval philosophy for us and so forth. So there are significant connections that I think are important. Philosophy of religion, of course, is always one that crosses the lines and so forth. So.
Yeah, so, well, it does make for some interesting contacts, I'm sure.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Who was department chair when you started out here?
Clifford Anderberg was the department chair. He'd come as department chair and been hired to hold that position.
And he'd been here for about how long?
I think he'd been here for about 6 years.
Yeah, several years. And before that, Wilfred Payne was
Wilfred
the,
Payne had been here, and I think his position was really professor of humanities.
Yes.
It wasn't specifically philosophy or religion, but he must have done all kinds of things and taught all kinds of classes.
Yeah, he's.
You knew him, didn't you?
I did. I knew him quite well.
Yeah.
But he left before, so you never really did know him.
I didn't meet him, so I didn't know him. But what he did before he left was to then sort of make this program one in philosophy and religion.
Yeah.
And he hired Clifford, or Clifford came after him to do that. And then other courses went, to English and so forth. But we had a large humanities program at that time, I think, that he was involved with. And this was a kind of specialization at that particular time.
So his influence was still around, even.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Oh, yes. Very much so.
Yeah. Ever hear any interesting stories about him? Or?
No, just...
That had been quite a while, I guess.
Quite a while before I got here, but we do get requests for information about him because he surely had a lot of impact on a lot of people at that particular time.
Yeah.
I think Jim Leslie, who's the head of our alumni association, had him and remembers him and so forth. I still see the picture over in Milo Bale Student Center of Jim opening the bowling alley on campus. He was obviously a radical.
Yeah, well, we did have a bowling alley in the Student Center, and we had a professional bowling league for a few years in Omaha. And when they left, the alleys went for a very cheap price, I guess, if any price at all.
I see.
And we had room for them, so they put them in the Student Center, and for 25 cents a line or whatever it was, you could go over and bowl in the Student Center.
Yeah. Well, I think in those days, student centers tried to provide entertainment opportunities. We had one in Southern Illinois, and it kept students on campus, kept them out of trouble, kept them interacting with each other. So,
well, what was the department like back when you first came here? What was the curriculum like, for example? Did you have a wide variety of courses, or was it much different now than it was then?
I would say that it's not very different because the people who were here when I came had in mind that the curriculum should be as broad as we could make it. We should make as wide a variety of classes available to our students because there was a lot of interest in different kinds of things. I would say that at present that's grown considerably because we've added a few people and been able to add to our offerings and so forth. We did the best we could in those days with a smaller number of people, but it's always been a program that's been designed to offer a wide range of courses. Never, no one ever wanted to specialize or to make it a department of linguistic philosophy or to, so in our hires all the time we've tried to bring in people who are not like the rest of us and would bring something new to our teaching and so forth.
And I'm sure you always get a large number of students who are taking philosophy to fulfill a humanities requirement or something.
Yes. I guess in the curriculum, one of the differences is that in the early days, you could take a course in logic and fulfill your math requirement.
Yes.
And somewhere along the line, that went out of fashion, and so we had taught a lot of logic in those days, and a lot of students took that rather than taking the math requirement.
They thought it was the easy way out. Sometimes they
were surprised. That's right. That's right.
Yes, I remember there was somebody who, I can't remember now all the details, but I remember some student coming into our office when I was dean.
Yes.
This isn't what logic. I mean, the professor was teaching symbolic logic.
Yes,
and, and this was pretty close to mathematics.
That's right. There were formal systems,
and
so
the
that's
student
why
was a bit surprised and not very happy.
Right. In philosophy, generally, we've moved away from teaching our freshmen symbolic logic, and we now have a course on critical thinking or critical reasoning, and that's been a trend throughout the country over the last 20 years. People have moved to that because it allows people to talk about different kinds of thinking, different ways of thinking about things. I think that's been a significant improvement in our curriculum, and it's a very popular course, and students do well to take it.
Well, you've what sort of courses have you been teaching primarily here?
Well, when I came, I taught aesthetics. That was very important to me. Belonged to the American Society of Aesthetics. Read my first professional paper to the British Society of Aesthetics in London, I think it was in 1974, and was very interested in that. And over the years, sort of lost interest. That is, the interest declined, and so I began to teach more courses in ethics, and I'd been teaching social and political philosophy, and Dwayne Willard had been teaching the ethics, the upper division ethics class, and he did that until he retired, and when he retired, then I was able to take over teaching that class, and I enjoy doing that. It's a way for me to keep up with things in the field that probably I wouldn't be able to do otherwise.
Now, your interest in ethics, if I remember, you had some joint appointments down at the medical center. Is your interest in ethics what led to that?
Yes, right. In the early 70s, this was sort of the beginning of what we call medical ethics, moral problems in medicine. And it was a new thing at that time, and so I wanted to be involved, and so they invited me to come down and teach a course on human values of medicine at the medical center, and so I did that to begin with. Then I had a fellowship from an Institute on Human Values of Medicine that enabled me to be an observer at the medical center. So I started out in the Department of Pediatrics and spent several months there. And much of that was spent in the emergency room, which was devoted, about half of their facilities devoted to pediatric emergencies. And so I spent a good deal of time there. I remember spending an evening there one night, and the medical student came out of the examining room, and he sort of slapped the little thing you look in people's eyes and ears and noses with, and slapped that in my hand and said, "I can't see anything. See what you can find." I had to explain that I wasn't that sort of doctor because I'd been introduced as Dr. Blizek. But I said, "No, I'm just here to observe," and so forth. That was very interesting to see all of the things that go on, and I got to OBGYN, and I got to one other department, which...
You had an appointment, if I remember looking at some of the information you gave me beforehand, you had an appointment in psychiatry.
That's right. After the
Nebraska Psychiatric Institute.
There was the Nebraska Psychiatric Institute was there at that time. It's no longer there.
Right.
And so they were looking to have somebody at the med center full time and come in. Walt Friedlander was there, and he had been sort of keeping it going, doing this sort of on an overload.
And that's Dr. Walter Friedlander, who was at the medical center.
Right, right.
A neurologist.
I think he was a neurologist, that's right. But he's very interested in the history of medicine and in medical ethics and questions of that sort. So after I'd been in the field for a while, they asked me to come down, and I spent a year sort of doing both things, teaching on our campus. What I did down there was actually, instead of teaching a class, I actually followed people around and sort of monitored the behavior and sat in on clinical discussions and so forth, and then I was to advise them about how they should proceed with that particular program, and they did then hire somebody full-time to come in and serve their needs.
That must have been a really interesting experience.
It was very interesting. My office was down in the lower floor of the building and past the patients and so forth, so I could stop in and play pool with the patients if I wanted, but that was a kind of exciting time for medical ethics. Yeah. Eventually, I thought that the kinds of questions that were being asked received whatever answer the person had predetermined, and that the real question wasn't about what should we do in this case or that case, but sort of who am I? And so I shifted over the years to, in my teaching of human values of medicine, to using literature and film instead of philosophy texts. And I think that's been, in many respects, much more successful. I think you need to sort of figure out who you are and why you think the things you do before you get to the point where you're asked to make those kinds of clinical decisions and to answer those kinds of questions. So
I hadn't thought of that before, but that's an interesting
there was something missing in just examining the traditional moral questions. When do we pull the plug and so forth? And so the kind of self-examination, which of course was how philosophy began when Socrates said, know thyself, and so forth. I'm fond of saying he said, know thyself. He didn't say, go do professional philosophy. And so that just seemed a very important ingredient that was missing in those things. So I've shifted, and I've always been satisfied with that shift. I think it's been very, very effective. Some of my best teaching in human values of medicine has resulted in people who then didn't go to medical school. They came to my class wanting to be...
Well, these are undergraduate courses now. We're not talking about medical center anymore.
That's right.
We're talking about human values in medicine, a course you taught here to undergraduates.
Yeah, and still teach. But when they discovered that their reasons for going into medicine were not good ones, and so they decided to do something else, I always thought that was very successful teaching, because you didn't want people going into medicine for the wrong reasons and then behaving badly because they didn't understand what they were about. And so that self-understanding was real important.
Another thing that you've been involved in that's certainly related to your teaching role is the Women's Studies program here at UNO. Can you tell us something about that?
Yes, I happened to get a book from a student of mine, which was a book called In a Different Voice by Carol Gilligan, which became one of the sort of standard feminist books. And it had some real interesting things to say about ethics in this. It was, the difference was an ethic of care as opposed to an ethic of obligation. And so as somebody interested in ethical issues, that was fun for me to consider. And I'd delivered a lecture and published a paper in this area. And so I published a paper called What Men Want to Know About the Ethics of Women. And so I qualified for the Women's Studies faculty because I'd been doing this. And so they, I think they only had one male at the time, and so I became the second, but I wanted to be supportive of that program. And then, as was the case in those days, and I'm hoping it's not nearly the case, we had not very many women, comparatively speaking. So when they were asked to not only teach their own courses, but also do something for women's studies and be on every committee so you could have a woman on, they were just horrendously overworked. And so at one moment, none of the women in the program, any woman who took over as the coordinator of the Women's Studies program was going to have to make a very significant sacrifice. And so I said I'd be happy to do that. I'd been a department chair, and so it was perfectly fine and knew how to do the administrative things. And so I stepped in until somebody finished a book or somebody had gotten another project or a grant written or things like that, and then they moved along. But it gave me an opportunity to work with them for a while and to promote that.
Yeah, that was back
program.
in the early 90s, right?
I think that was the early 90s, and it was then that I established the Pearl Blizek Women's Studies Scholarship, and I also established an endowment for the Women's Studies program. It's not a very big one. We've added to it a little over the years, but it does give them some extra money occasionally, and as Dean know, that little extra money is always a benefit, really helps. I have a hard time saying no when they call me from either Missouri or Southern Illinois and ask for money. I can't say no because I know how important it is to us. And, so.
See some of the other things you've been involved in. Well, let's talk for a minute about some of the biblical archaeology efforts that your department has actually become rather famous for.
That's right. That's right.
Started many years ago, in some ways, with professor of humanities that we had here, wasn't it? With
that's right. His
Dr.
name was
Sager?
Joe Sager. Yeah. Joe Sager is a very, very famous archaeologist. I see him occasionally. He's down, I think, at Mississippi State and has a whole center for archaeology down there that he heads. Just an absolutely terrific scholar and a great individual. Just worked very hard and very easy to work with and so forth. I think, if I remember correctly, he came to work in the College of Fine Arts originally.
Yeah, he was teaching art history or something with an archaeological emphasis.
That's right. That's right. And
then he directed our humanities program for a while.
For a while, he was working with the humanities program, which was the large sections of humanities.
We had a general humanities course that you could take.
It was very
10 hours,
interdisciplinary.
I guess, couldn't you?
That's right.
5-hour courses.
That's correct. And so he worked with that. I think you're right. I think he did direct that for a while before taking the position. Which really allowed him.
He left here and went down and headed up the Children's Museum in Omaha for a while, didn't he?
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Oh,
and then he moved from that position down to
Mississippi State. I know that he wanted to be able to do more in archaeology, and so I'm sure he was looking for that. And I don't remember the name of the site, but he has a site of his own.
It was Tel Halif or something like that.
Something like that, that he's been working with for many, many years and so on. And then when he left, we had a little gap. We had a very distinguished scholar and a terrific colleague named Jonathan Rosenbaum, who came to be our Judaic Studies scholar.
Another biblical scholar.
Right, right. But it wasn't until Jonathan left and took a job elsewhere.
He went to Hartford, didn't he?
He went to the University of Hartford, right. And then Richard Freund came. And Richard is the person who got us involved with the Bethsaida Excavations project. And archaeology is a difficult area to find funding for. People are interested in it, but it's for some reason difficult to find money. So Richard put together a consortium of about 12 or 15 schools that pay a fee each year, and with that money he was able to arrange for the University of Nebraska at Omaha to have I think we're the only university that has its own license to excavate this particular site. And the city of Bethsaida is an especially important excavation site. It's the site where Jesus is to have worked miracles and to have walked on water and fed the multitudes, and it's an important point, a physical point in the Bible. But also it was a site that was lost. It had been covered over and was more pristine because it had not been built on again and again and again. The things they removed when they first got there to get down to the actual gate of the city and the fisherman's house were Syrian gun emplacements and rocks and things of that sort. But for archaeological sites, it's a very, very rare site.
Yeah, there was some, well, not controversy, but some difficulty as to where it was actually located.
That's right, that's right. It wasn't located, I think, until about 1987. And Rami Arav did some testing, tried some things out at, I think there were 3 places they thought Bethsaida might be, and they did this one, and he decided that this, for whatever reasons,
and
was...
Professor Arav is now teaching in your department.
He teaches for us and works with Tom Gutierre in International Studies, and he's the head archaeologist for the excavation. Richard Freund has moved on now to the University of Hartford. But Rami is here, and one of the most interesting things about the Bethsaida excavation site is that Bethsaida was a city, it was a fishing village, but the site where it's presently located is about 1.5 miles from the Sea of Galilee. And so the question was, how could this be that village? So our geologists, Jack Schroeder and others, went over and did some testing and discovered, of course, that the Sea of Galilee is much smaller presently than it was before. And it was a wonderful collaboration between our geologists and people in geography and geology and people in biblical studies and religion and literature and all of that. And it is one of our distinguished projects, I think.
And as you said, a collaborative effort too, with which gets you involved with other institutions.
That's right. That's right.
And great for our students.
Oh, absolutely. My daughter went last year. She had been teaching in France, and before she came home, she went over to I think she just spent 6 days there, but it was just a terrific experience.
And we have some students who work there in excavations for a whole summer.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And they're transformed by that experience, I think.
Yeah, it must be.
So.
Is the current disarray in Israel causing problems with that at all?
I don't think anyone seems to be affected by it at the moment. It's in a physical location that's not problematic.
Not tactically significant.
Well, yes. And
strategically significant.
Yeah, and it's safe. Didn't really worry about Nicole being there and so forth. There were bombings elsewhere. But this is I think, a pretty safe place. Now, what happens from here on may come back to affect this site and its location and who you have to deal with and so forth to excavate and so forth. So that's a problem.
Well, tell me how you got involved in this.
Well, my real involvement was not as a participant, because I've never been to Bethsaida, but as chair of the department, seeing my colleagues involved in this, I had to do a lot of work for them to help them carry out the project and move it forward.
So it was administrative.
It was administrative and fundraising and things of that sort.
Being chair of a department, particularly department with 2 disciplines in it, must have made some interesting challenges for you. You served how many terms?
I served one term in the middle 70s, I guess, 74 to 77, something like that, and one again in the 90s. The problem is that it really increases your workload.
Yes.
Because you're really trying to be supportive of two separate programs, and you work with the faculty separately and so on. But in terms of the work you do, it's pretty much, I think, what chairs do for any department. The tasks are the same and so forth. You probably just do a little more of it because there's two programs. And I suppose if in psychology you had two specializations, it would be a similar phenomenon, I think.
Well, speaking of work effort and taking on various responsibilities, you certainly have not shirked this kind of task. I've noticed you've taken on many responsibilities while you've been here at UNO, serving in various committees and graduate council and.
I probably didn't do that very much when I first got here. Probably was interested more in my own work and that sort of thing. But over the years, it seemed to me that things went well when people paid attention to their colleagues and their programs and to the university. And if people didn't do that, many of the things we do at the university would not be done.
Yeah, I've always seen that as sort of a responsibility that faculty members have. If you're going to talk about self-governance, you've got to be involved in
That's correct. That's correct. Also, I think in some ways it was a selfish thing because as the committees worked well, things went better for me, and so it was sort of, yeah, you do have to pay your dues if you want to other people to do it and for these things to get done and so forth. So I think that after my divorce, I got more involved in university activities and so forth, and began to do those kinds of things, and saw not quite that this was my family, but it was a home for me in an important sense, and you wanted to make your contribution to the community because you wanted the community to be successful.
Well, you've certainly been, I think your colleagues appreciate that, and you were recognized at least in some way with by joining a very select group, the recipients of the Chancellor's Medal a few years ago.
Yes, and I was very delighted. That occurred at a graduation ceremony where Shirley Goldstein was awarded an honorary degree for her efforts on human rights, and I had nominated Shirley for that award, so we got to be on the platform together that day. And
she's well known for her activities back in the days of the Soviet Union, where she took Bibles to
That's right. She was
right in the middle of things in the Soviet Union.
Very active. Republicans like to say it was Ronald Reagan, but I think it was probably Shirley Goldstein who brought down the Berlin Wall. She surely encouraged people to protest the lack of religious freedom, which was her primary concern, and it was just something that bothers her. People ought to be able to practice their religion, and they weren't able to, or they were discouraged in the Soviet Union, and so she formed an organization, Freedom for Soviet Jewry, and still works in that area, is known around the world for her efforts. She did meet with President Reagan before he met with Gorbachev. She was one of the people he consulted before that famous meeting and so forth. And so that was a nice thing to have happen, to be able to be on the platform with her and share that experience.
Yeah. Well, it was a nice recognition for the work that you've done too, I think.
I appreciated that very much. Del Weber made those choices, and I was very pleased that he selected me for that.
Now, while we're at it, talking about a number of accomplishments that you had as department chair, I remember back in my early days as dean, and you were chair of the department. you got that position, the first position in Judaic Studies established.
It's the very first position in Judaic Studies. Rabbi Sidney Brooks had been teaching occasionally years ago, maybe when Wilfred Payne was here. And but we didn't have anyone to do it on a regular basis, and so we worked with the people at the Livingston Foundation and people in the community, and they helped us get some money to get this position started. I think they paid part of the salary, diminishing part over a number of years till we could sort of work it into the budget and so forth. And Daniel
that's when we
Breslau,
hired. Was Jonathan the first?
The first person to hold the job, who was only here for 1 year, was Daniel Breslau.
Oh, yes, yes. Okay.
That's right.
And
that. Daniel went on to the University of Kansas, but came back to be the first speaker in the Rabbi Sidney H. Brooks lecture series, which was a real thrill to have him come back.
Yes.
And then he was followed by Jonathan Rosenbaum, who was here for a number of years, and continued that position. Guy Madelone now holds the position. We've just hired him to fill that spot, and he's an outstanding young faculty member. You couldn't ask for a better colleague, and he's going to be a very fine scholar and teacher, and so was a great addition to the department to have that line.
Well, we've talked about a number of different people as we've been conversing here, and we have just a couple minutes left. Can we talk maybe about anybody that we may have forgotten? You mentioned, for example, when you first came here that Kirk Naylor was the president. Back in those days, if I remember, the president, and that was the title we used back then, as you mentioned. It's now changed to chancellor, but back in those days, the president interviewed every job applicant. Do you remember that interview? What kind of a person was Kirk?
Well, I don't remember a lot about him because he was only here for a year. And then he was no longer president. Vic Blackwell from the art department, I think art history, stepped in. I still have some of Vic's Christmas cards. He would do a little print and send them out as Christmas cards, and we still have them in our home and so forth. But Vic was interim, and then Ron Roskins came. And that changed things. There was a new spirit. Ron hadn't been connected with the municipal university, didn't think of it as a municipal university and so forth. And I found him very supportive and helpful. And then, of course, he was followed by Del Weber. And Del made a lot of changes, made a lot of contributions to this institution, really moved it forward.
Well, I'm getting a signal here that it's time for us to wrap up.
Okay.
So I really
thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
It's hard to get everything in. So
it is.
I understand.
Thank you very much for
You're
joining
welcome.
us today. And to our audience, thank you for joining us in a visit with Bill Blizek, Professor of Philosophy for a long time here at UN Omaha. We've been taking a look at some of the history of UN Omaha as seen through the eyes of the history makers. This is Jack Newton inviting you to join us again in the series we call Reflections in Time.
Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.